Good day. Again, as I am making this video, there have been some scattered reports of missile strikes from Russia against Ukraine. I have to say these reports are extremely tentative. I'm not entirely sure whether this is a major missile attack. If it is, I will discuss it in more detail in my next video, probably tomorrow. In the meantime, and just by extension, I've noticed that the British Ministry of Defence has now brought up the fact that a Soviet cruise missile has been found in Ukraine with ballast in place of its original warhead. And the British Ministry of Defence has claimed that this particular cruise missile, having been brought out from the former Soviet arsenal, is proof that the Russians are running out of cruise missiles. All I'm going to say about that, and very briefly, is that this is desperate. This is a very old story. It's one that I read about in the Russian media some time ago, that they were using old Soviet cruise missiles in order to provide decoys to distract and confuse the Ukrainian air defense system. I can't see that there is any basis upon which the British Ministry of Defence can make the deduction from the use of these old missiles that it has done. Anyway, that's all I'm going to say about these missile attacks at the moment. Now, yesterday there was a great deal of news from the military fronts. Today there's less. This is very typical of the situation at the present time. There was a report early this morning that a Ukrainian force has been encircled by the Russians in a village called Novo-Mikhailovo near Vuhledar. I can't confirm whether this is true or not, and there's been fewer reports about this since. Eventually, and no doubt, we will get a full account of what is going on in this particular part of the battlefronts, but at the moment, as I said, information is very scant. Lastly, since I'm talking about the battlefronts and what has been happening on the battlefronts, well, I'm going to just briefly allude to another article which has appeared in the Daily Telegraph. This has talked about the situation in Kherson City. It spoke about very, very heavy shelling of Kherson City by the Russians. That is indisputable, by the way. The Russians are now heavily and methodically shelling and launching missile strikes on Ukrainian forces all across Kherson region west of the Dnieper River. But what I found was interesting about this particular article is that it admitted that corpses of people are being left on the streets of Kherson City, where apparently the scale of the shelling and the bombardment makes it difficult for the Ukrainians to collect these bodies. Well, that was in the Daily Telegraph. It didn't stay up, by the way, on the main website for very long, but the article can still be found. It's not been deleted, and that's what it says. Anyway, this is a brief summary of the situation. No doubt I'll be making a more detailed summary later as more news trickles in. There's been information that the Ukrainians again are trying to repair the damage done by the Russian missile strikes of a few days ago. Each missile strike, as I said, has a greater cumulative effect than its predecessors. The Ukrainians carry out their repairs, the Russians wait, they see what the Ukrainians are going to do, what their Western friends, what Ukraine's Western friends are going to do, and then they launch another series of missile strikes. I'm just going to add one further little detail, which is that there's been more reports of Ukraine taking very seriously the risks from the north, from Belarus. There's been reports now, there's lots of reports of Ukraine busy creating fortifications to protect Kiev from an attack from the north. And there's also reports that the Ukrainians are concentrating large numbers of troops in Kharkiv city in anticipation of another Russian attack on Kharkiv city. Whether such attacks take place, of course, is an entirely different matter. Anyway, I always, as I've said, start with a brief summary of the news from the actual battlefields. But overall, as I said, the situation is stable. And as I've said previously, this is how the Russians want it to be as they build up their forces in Ukraine, as the 380,000 reservists and volunteers who have joined the military in Ukraine are gradually being inducted, as Russian weapons, tanks, armored vehicles, aircraft, all of those things are increasingly concentrated in this area in Ukraine in preparation for, well, we'll have to wait and see for what. But in the meantime, I'm going to focus in this program on the activities of perhaps the most important Russian of all, who is President Putin. And he has had an astonishingly busy 24 hours. Putin does this, by the way. He sometimes disappears from view for a couple of days and then he resurfaces, and then we see that he does a whole lot of things, all one after the other, at extraordinary tempo and with the usual remarkable focus and attention to detail that he's able to bring to all of these things. So we've had reports of a meeting of Russia's Security Council. This is Russia's top policy-making body. Now, when the last meeting of the Security Council took place about a week ago, I said that the Kremlin readout was very short. It spoke about a discussion of civil defense. I was deeply skeptical that that was all that they discussed. And I suggested that it was inconceivable that Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister who just attended the APEC summit in the Cambodian capital Phnom Penh and the G20 summit in Bali, would not have provided a report to the Security Council about his visits, about his attendance to these summits, and that Naryshkin, the head of the SVR, the Russian intelligence agency, would not have provided a briefing to the Security Council about his talks with the CIA director, William Burns, in Ankara. Well, I still think that, but the Kremlin's readout, in fact, not just the readout, but the comments that it reported from President Putin, give the impression that these briefings, these reports from Lavrov and Naryshkin about the APEC summit, the G20, and the meeting with Burns in Ankara, that they were provided to the Security Council yesterday. In other words, more than a week after these important summit meetings took place. I don't believe that. I'm going to say that straight away, but probably somebody in Moscow realized that it was just inconceivable, that it begged belief that there wasn't a report from the Security, that the Security Council wasn't publishing a report about these things. And I'm pretty sure that, as I said, those reports were probably delivered earlier, closer to the events that Lavrov and Naryshkin would have attended. Anyway, putting that aside, Putin is also reported to have said that he provided a report of his conversations with President Aliyev of Azerbaijan. Apparently there have been two. And of course, Putin has also attended a summit meeting of the Collective Security Treaty Organization in Armenia, where there's been more debate about how to resolve the Armenian-Azerbaijanian crisis, with the Prime Minister of Armenia, Nikol Pashinyan, saying that he was dissatisfied with some of the final documents that were produced by the Collective Security Treaty Organization. So Putin will have provided reports about all of this to the Security Council. He's been busy talking to Aliyev. Aliyev, by the way, has rejected Pashinyan's suggestion of another summit meeting involving, this time, President Macron of France, in effect forcing Pashinyan to stick with the formula of meetings with Putin. And so Putin has had those discussions. He's involved with the discussions between the Armenians and the Azerbaijanians as he works, and the Russians work towards what I suspect they see as a final comprehensive settlement of the conflict in the Caucasus between Armenia and Azerbaijan. So that those meetings, the Security Council meeting, the telephone conversations with Aliyev, that was part of what Putin did. He also attended a big meeting of the Rostec Corporation. Now, Rostec is a giant corporation created 15 years ago by the Russian government. It is state-owned. It brings together, in effect, the key parts of Russia's military-industrial complex: its aircraft industry, its shipbuilding industry, its missile construction industry, all the various design bureaus and laboratories and all of those things. But it also plays an increasingly large role in Russia's civilian economy. Rostec, for example, is the umbrella organization that brings together the various industrial plants and factories and design offices that make Russia's civil airline fleet, which is, of course, increasingly important. It's also involved in all kinds of other areas as well, like shipbuilding, for example, and other sectors. There's been some comparisons made, I'm not sure how valid these are, between the importance of Rostec within the context of the Russian industrial economy and Samsung within the context of South Korea's industrial economy. That these two companies are somehow analogous with each other, though it's important to stress that Rostec, unlike Samsung, is entirely state-owned. Anyway, Putin attended a meeting at Rostec, which, as I said, is now celebrating its 15th anniversary. And of course, he discussed at length military production and talked about the importance of upgrading military production, not just apparently in order to supply weapon systems to the Russian military that's fighting in Ukraine, though he talked extensively about that, but also in order and with a view to continuing the development of Russia's military industries, and indeed in continuing the supply of modern weapon systems for the Russian armed forces going forward, even beyond the war, so that they can continue to be a powerful deterrent against the Western powers. And he spoke a lot about that. And by the way, he also discussed Rostec's increasing role in Russia's civilian economy. And for those who are interested, he talked, I noticed, about microelectronics as being an area of priority for Rostec to develop. And this comes shortly after the Russian Academy of Sciences elected a new president who happens to be an acknowledged expert in microprocessor production. This issue of microprocessors is one that's been talked about very, very often. I've said previously that I strongly suspect that microchip production in Russia is at a larger, bigger level and a more advanced level than people in the West care to acknowledge. And I've spoken about Rostec being at the center of this, and all of the indications from this meeting with Rostec rather reinforce that. By the way, whilst I'm on the topic of the president of the Academy of Sciences, who's just been elected, who, as I said, is an expert on microchip production, that could be for one of two reasons. Firstly, because of the priority that's given to microchip production. So you put an expert in microchip production and development at the head of your major scientific institution. But it could also have been a reward to this person for achievements already accomplished in precisely this area. The two are not mutually exclusive. So, a meeting with the Security Council, important discussions with President Aliyev of Azerbaijan, a very important meeting at the Rostec Corporation, in which, by the way, Putin also spoke about how developments in military technology and military industries can also be transferred to the civilian economy, strengthening Russia's technological position in civilian industries as well. So, Rostec is making advanced microchips. Well, some of them can be transferred to develop Russia's own products, technological products. With Putin, by the way, previously in a meeting, a conference on artificial intelligence developments, this was a couple of days ago, talking about Russia setting up its own alternative cloud systems. Anyway, things like that. But anyway, all of these various meetings that Putin has been involved in, overshadowed by the meeting which has undoubtedly attracted the biggest attention in Russia, and which has been, of course, broadcast on Russian television. And that was a meeting between Putin and the mothers of Russian soldiers who have been engaged in the war, in the conflict in Ukraine. Now, I'm going to say a few things about this meeting. The first is that this meeting is an indicator, again, of the extent to which Russia has changed and of the extent to which Putin's position as Russia's president is not directly analogous to that of Russian leaders in the past. Throughout the Second World War, Joseph Stalin, to my knowledge, never met with the families of Soviet servicemen. Nor did Leonid Brezhnev, at least in public, meet with the families of Soviet servicemen during, say, the conflict in Afghanistan in the 1980s, whilst he was president. Soviet leaders tended not to do this. And by the way, there has never been much criticism. In fact, as far as I know, there's never been any criticism of their failure to meet with the families, the mothers of Soviet servicemen within the Soviet Union or within Russia. This was simply something that didn't happen, and nobody ever expected it to happen. Well, this time, this meeting with the mothers of Russian soldiers who've been participating in the special military operation, that received a lot of advanced attention. There was reports about it coming, the fact that this meeting was pending, that there were reports about this for several days, about a week before it eventually happened. And as I said, it's been given heavy coverage in the Russian media. And it was a very interesting meeting. Interesting for me because even though, as I said, it is an indicator of the extent to which Russia has changed, the fact that the president of Russia now feels a moral duty to meet with the mothers of soldiers, it also showed how different Russia continues to be from the West, because the way in which the President Putin interacted with these mothers, I think would have been very different, is very different from what one would expect if, say, the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of Britain were to meet with the mothers of servicemen in the same way. I would make one point, by the way, a specific point, and it's a point which, you know, people might just note that, again, the fact that Putin specifically met with mothers as opposed to parents, in other words, fathers were not present, is already something which I think would have been different from the way things would be done in a similar way in Britain. I don't know about the United States so well, but I suspect it would have been different in the United States too. I suspect that the idea that there is a special connection between a mother and a son is accepted in Russia. It's not a big issue there, but it might not be so well received in the West. There might be a feeling that, you know, this was, if you like, a gender issue which people might not be so comfortable about today. Anyway, this was, in Russia itself, a completely uncontroversial aspect of this meeting. Now, the other thing to say is that the mothers of these soldiers tended to come, as far as I can see, from the families that traditionally provide soldiers to the Russian army. And that tends to mean that they were not perhaps from the intellectual class of Russian society. They're closer to being working class people. They're not all of them. It's important to say that not all of them were. One of them apparently is a poet. But anyway, they are from the sort of people who support the army, who support the military, and who are perhaps by definition patriotic. And all of the mothers fell fully within that category. There was, however, alongside this, a clear intention to make sure that the families were drawn from the various different ethnicities that make up Russia. So there was a Chechen mother, there was a mother from Dagestan, which is another Caucasian republic, there was another mother from Tuva, which is a region of Russia where, again, there's a large, the dominant ethnicity from which this particular mother came is of a Turkic people. And of course there were Russians, but there were also Russians who were straightforward Russians, but there were, you know, normal Russians, if you like, but there were also Cossacks, people of that kind. And there was, again, heavy emphasis on the fact that this was a conflict in which the entire Russian nation, a nation made up of many ethnicities, is involved in, and in which it participates, and in which everybody is engaged, or whatever one's ethnicity is, everybody's engaged in it together. And again, it was striking to see how the mothers of these sons who were in the military, how they all, without exception, accepted this without qualification. I think that this is an aspect of this conflict which perhaps is not widely understood in the West, but it is, and in fact one of the mothers actually said as much, that the military conflict with Ukraine within Russia itself has had nation building aspects. It has consolidated Russian society. It has brought the various parts of Russian society, apart from those parts of the, if you like, the middle class and the intelligentsia that are already anyway alienated from the political system. Not many of those, by the way, but the rest of Russian society has basically consolidated around this war to an extent that I think is underestimated in the West. And I should say that all of my contacts with people in Russia have strongly reinforced the view that this is indeed the case. Anyway, once again, as I said, this meeting between Putin and the mothers of these soldiers was intended, I think, to highlight that fact. And last but not least, the mothers were selected, because clearly there was a process of selection, very carefully to include mothers whose sons are serving actively as soldiers in the battle, other mothers whose sons have been severely wounded, and one of them I noticed was wounded, I think, back in the summer, but is expected to rejoin his unit in January, so he was clearly somebody who suffered heavy wounds. And there were at least 2 mothers whose sons had died in action. And this, of course, gave those mothers an opportunity to express their intense, passionate feelings about the loss of their sons, and it gave Putin, as president of Russia, an opportunity to speak about this, to share in their pain, to make it clear that he was aware of their feelings, and also at the same time, on the part of both the mothers and of Putin, to express pride in the sacrifice of their sons and in the patriotism that everybody at this meeting felt. Now, it was, if I may say so, a very measured meeting. There were none of this sort of, shall we say, more ostentatious actions that one might expect in the West. There was a general avoidance of some of the sentimentality. Some might say mawkishness, but then, of course, when people die in battle, feelings can become very strong and things can sort of brim over sometimes. But there was nothing like any prayer meetings or anything of that kind over the course of this meeting, no joint prayers or anything of that kind, though Putin was careful to reference religion and to reference the fact that the people, the mothers, the mothers who were at this meeting, they came from different faiths. There were Christians, there were Muslims, there were presumably Buddhist people, and there were people, no doubt, with no religion at all. But anyway, they were all there, but there was nothing, as I said, like prayer meetings or things of that kind. That, by the way, would not be well received in Russia. Once upon a time, though I suspect no longer, it might have been well received in the United States, but it's never been how the Russians do these things, and it was not what happened at this meeting. And there was criticisms, and this is another part of this whole discussion. And these criticisms were very detailed and went into a great many things. There's not much criticism of the actual conduct of the military operation as such, but there were criticisms about the fact that that the uniforms which were being provided were not fit for purpose, that the mother of a sniper was comparing a person in the special forces, was saying that her son's uniform was too heavy, it didn't have proper camouflage. There was criticisms about inadequate provision of social benefits. There was criticisms about provision of kit. There was criticisms about the fact that, especially in the eastern regions, which have been liberated, as the Russians would say, from Ukrainian forces, there's lots of street children there. The soldiers, apparently the Russian soldiers, have adequate food, which they share with these children, but there is concern from some of the mothers that these children are not receiving the kind of care and attention that they should be. There was an awful lot about that. And there were plenty of admissions from Putin that things are not always as they should be. He spoke at length, for example, about how it had probably been a mistake on the part of the Russian government to persist with the Minsk process for as long as it did, that they should have come to an understanding sooner that Donbass wanted to leave Ukraine and to rejoin Russia. Putin acknowledged that if this had happened earlier, Ukraine would not have been built up militarily to the extent that it has been, and the conflict therefore might have been shorter and that fewer lives might have been lost. So Putin acknowledged all of that. But of course he also acknowledged, as I said, some of these problems with some of social cares and legislation to make provision for people. He said quite interestingly at one time that there's actually a bill being prepared to cover one of these issues, which has been prepared in the parliament, but there are always arguments, conflicts about this. And he said rather plaintively, something which I know from my own background is true, that when you have two lawyers looking at a draft of a bill, or indeed a draft of anything, you're going to get at least three opinions. And I'm afraid that is entirely correct. But anyway, he said that they're all doing within the government what they can, and that they will work hard to try to meet all of these concerns. Putin also made an admission, by the way, which is unusual for a political leader to make. I mean, when political leaders, in the West at least, meet with mothers in this kind of situation, in this kind of meeting, in my experience, discussions often rarely go beyond platitudes. There's very little of the kind of detailed discussion that we saw at this meeting, a meeting which went on for hours, by the way, with every single mother invited to state her opinion, talk about her son, discuss the son's role in the conflict. Anyway, that's not what tends to happen in the West. And of course, when in impromptu meetings, sometimes people do ask pointed questions of their leaders in the West. Usually, the answers they get are evasive. They're not so in Putin's case. But Putin did something unusual. He admitted that he'd prepared for the meeting, that he'd been carefully briefed in advance, that he had an idea before the meeting took place of the kind of concerns that the mothers might bring up. He spoke about the fact that he'd been briefed by the defense minister, by Shoigu, and that he'd also had a meeting with Tatiana Golikova, the deputy prime minister of the Russian government, who is involved in providing information, who supervises the general welfare and health systems in Russia. It's becoming increasingly Putin's pattern. He makes no attempt, in other words, to pretend that he is omniscient, that he doesn't prepare for meetings, that he doesn't get briefed, that there aren't other people who help him to prepare for these meetings, even though they're not usually in attendance when the meetings themselves take place. Because, of course, if they were, if Shoigu and Golikova were there, then it would not be a meeting between Putin and the mothers. It would be a meeting between senior officials, including Putin and the mothers, and that direct, intimate connection between the president and these women, that would be broken. Well, again, this isn't something that, as I said, people in the West, leaders in the West, want to advertise. The fact that they prepare carefully for meetings in advance, that they receive briefings, and that they're told before it happens that the kind of questions that they might get asked, and that they, to a certain extent, prepare their answers in advance. Again, I find that refreshing. I wish this was done more often. I see no harm in this. I didn't get the impression that the mothers were in the slightest bit offended or put out by that. Far better that they know that their president takes the meeting seriously, that he works hard in preparation for it, then he comes and pretends that he knows everything and doesn't need to consult with others before he speaks. So overall, my impression was that this was extremely effective television. Again, it's different from how this sort of thing would probably be done in the West. It shows, as I said, how in Russia things are done differently there. It conveyed, however, a sense of determination, of unity, of national unity, and it also showed once again to the Russian people, to the troops, the soldiers on the front line, and of course to the families of those soldiers, that the President, Putin himself, the commander-in-chief, is aware of the many problems that take place there, that these soldiers and their families suffer, that he's interested in these problems, that he's trying to do something to remedy these problems, that he's prepared to listen and debate these issues with people who want to bring these topics up with him. And as I said, I think in terms of Russian viewers, those of them who were prepared to sit through this whole meeting, and I suspect, by the way, that would be a large number of people in Russia, well, I suspect that this was an impressive meeting and one which will have strengthened even further the confidence that Russians have in Putin. Now, on that topic, by the way, we've had more opinion polls. Russia repeatedly takes measures to establish what Putin's support level and that of other Russian politicians is. And it's fair to say that about a year ago, Putin was polling sort of mid-60s, which was, usual level that he hits during quiet periods. After the conflict began, it shot up to around 80+%, and it's remained fairly steady since then. It's had its ups and downs. There was a brief dip after the Kherson withdrawal, for example. Not a significant one, statistically an insignificant one, but he felt around 79%. But over the last couple of days, that rating has gone up slightly, and I suspect that after this meeting, it will probably go up even more. He came across as in control, in charge, well-informed, and caring. And I think that at a time of conflict, that is probably the message that he needed to convey. But what does this meeting tell us about the military operation as a whole? Did we learn anything which we didn't already know? Well, I don't think that we did exactly, but it did confirm certain things that we've already, I think, basically worked out, and which Putin made implicitly. And that is that the Russians are going to see this thing through. I mean, that was clearly Putin's message. There was no sign there of any loss of confidence, of any worry about the fact that the Ukrainians have made some gains in Kharkiv region and in Kherson region or anything of that kind. Putin didn't seem to be fazed by any of that. He came across as confident and he came across as determined. And by the way, that seemed to be the mood on the part of the mothers as well, including those mothers who've actually lost their sons. They want to see this thing through. They feel that this is a war, or at least this is the message that was conveyed, that this is a war that was enforced upon them. Putin went out of his way to repeat this again. He said that the Russians have spent a huge amount of time, in all sincerity, to try to find a negotiated solution to this conflict from within the framework of the Minsk agreements. And they've come to that conclusion that that's never going to happen, that this is impossible, that this is a war imposed on them, and that they will see it through. Now, you may agree with that analysis, or you may not, but that was certainly the mood that Putin wanted to convey. It was the mood the mothers at this meeting appeared to share. And from many indications I've received from across Russia, both statistical in forms of opinion polls, but also many anecdotal ones, I think that does reflect very closely the public mood. Now, either before or after he had these meetings with the mothers, that was obviously the big centerpiece meeting of the last couple of hours, Putin had yet another meeting with another important person, and this is Ramzan Kadyrov, the president of Chechnya, one of the constituent republics of the Russian Federation, and somebody who has provided a large contingent of Chechen fighters who have been participating on the Russian side in the war. Now, the Kremlin readout was very short, didn't tell us very much, except that Kadyrov briefed Putin extensively, apparently, about his opinions and experiences of the conflict. Kadyrov, for his part, has provided a much longer explanation or discussion of what Kadyrov and Putin were talking about, but the overall overwhelming sense one got from Kadyrov's account is that he was very pleased and very satisfied with the discussions he had with Putin. Now, bear in mind that Kadyrov is very much a hardliner in terms of this conflict. He's somebody who clearly wants to see this conflict in Ukraine end in an unequivocal victory. So if he comes out of a meeting with Putin appearing pleased, and he clearly does, then that suggests that whatever it was that he heard from Putin about the direction and objectives of this operation, this military operation, conforms with Kadyrov's perspective of the way the war is going. And perhaps not coincidentally, we've had an interview from the Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov to Russian television. And Lavrov spoke about the liberation of the Ukrainian people from the current regime, which he spoke about the fact that it adheres to the ideology that became prevalent in Central Europe, in Germany particularly, during the 1930s and 1940s. And Lavrov spoke about that as a given thing. And by the way, and in parenthesis, he also poo-pooed the idea that the Ukrainians would be able to recapture Crimea, which he went out of his way to say is extremely well defended. And by the way, I'm sure on that, Lavrov is right. So, a few days ago, Dmitry Peskov, the presidential spokesman, said that there is no Russian agenda for regime change in Ukraine. But Lavrov's comments, and Lavrov is a more senior official than Peskov by orders of magnitude. He's, after all, somebody who sits in Russia's Security Council, and he's a minister of the Russian government. Anyway, Lavrov's comments appear to me to suggest otherwise. So, a message from Putin, from the Russians: unity, purpose, determination to see this operation through to its conclusion, however long it takes. And of course they do so in the confidence that they have a stable economy. The economic position in Russia has stabilized. The ruble has been steady. They don't seem to be at all concerned about the discussions that have been taking place in Europe about the oil price cap. They've clearly sorted out arrangements with China and India and all of those other countries. And one senses that with the Russian build-up continuing, with the 380,000 plus reservists and volunteers joining the Russian military, the Russians feel that the initiative is passing back to them, that Ukraine has basically shot its bolt, that it's run its course, that its offensive in Kharkiv has come to a stop, and the occupation of Kherson, as the Ukrainian General Staff itself said it feared, that's turned into a trap with, according to the Daily Telegraph, the Russians able to shell Ukrainian forces in Kherson and the Ukrainians unable even to collect the bodies. By the way, on that topic, just to finish on that, Ukraine is now again talking about the importance of evacuating the civilian population, what's left of it, from Kherson city, which will no doubt, if it's ever completed, leave the city a completely empty shell. So, there we are. It's, I think, widely expected or hoped by some people in the West. There have been a whole series of reports in the West. I've talked about them, articles that I've seen by people like Con Coughlin, Simon Tisdall, The Economist magazine. These are all British, of course, but in the United States it's a little different. All of them looking forward, hoping for the fall of Vladimir Putin, for the Russians to lose their determination to see this war through, to run out of weapons, to run out of missiles. We had that strange story about the fact that the Russians are using old missiles for decoys as proof that they're running out of new missiles that are actually going to do the actual kinetic damage. Well, all of that, as I said, we see all of that constantly coming out of the West, but the mood in Russia and the facts on the ground and Putin's comments about the Rostec Corporation, all of that points in a completely different direction to Russian determination to see this thing through, even if it takes a long time, even if it has to be done slowly and incrementally in order to save Russian lives, but a determination to get it done. And no sign that the government of Russia itself is in any particular danger, or that Putin's position in Russia is in any particular danger. Well, that's Putin. He's spoken at great length. He's given a very interesting account of things. And as I said, he's been very busy over the last few hours, and he's given us a fairly interesting picture of what is going on inside his mind and also of where the Russians are taking all of this. Well, another leader has spoken. I say leader, of course, she's no longer a leader, she's a former leader. Angela Merkel, the former German Chancellor, has now given a lengthy interview to Der Spiegel, the German magazine. And one has to pass Merkel's comments very carefully in order to try to understand and get through to her meaning. But the overwhelming sense I got when she's talking about the essential collapse of relations between Russia and Germany, between Russia and Europe, is of enormous regret and a belief on Merkel's part that if she'd been in control, she would have somehow prevented this crisis from taking place. Now, she spoke, for example, about the fact that last year, in 2021, she, together with Macron, tried to get a discussion, a conversation between the European Union and Russia organized. And I remember this. I remember this proposal when it was floated. I thought at the time that it might have been Macron's initiative, but it turns out Merkel has basically told us that it was Merkel's idea. She could see, it seems, that the situation was deteriorating. He was worried about where this vital relationship would go once she was removed from the scene. And she made one last attempt to get a dialogue between the Russians and the Europeans going. However, what she discovered is that the Russians by this point were skeptical. She spoke about how previously she'd had meetings, one-to-one meetings with Putin. Her meetings with Putin were one-to-one, but on this occasion, the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov also attended the meeting, and she interpreted this as a sign that the Russians were becoming more skeptical about her and doubtful that she would be able to deliver on her promises because her power was slipping away, since everybody knew that she would not be Chancellor of Germany for much longer. But she also spoke regretfully of her failure to get the European Council, the leading body of the European community, the European Union, united behind this initiative, how she ran into opposition from the Baltic states, from Poland, from the Netherlands, from Mark Rutte's government, from Mark Rutte himself, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands, and that it became impossible, therefore, for her to conduct this dialogue with the Russians. Didn't quite say where she expected this dialogue to go, but she also talked about the fact that the Minsk agreement, the roadmap to peace, which it's now largely admitted, both from the Russian and the German side, Merkel largely authored, that the Minsk agreement had by this time become hollowed out. Again, she's very careful not to attribute the blame for this to the Ukrainians, even though President Poroshenko of Ukraine has essentially admitted, openly admitted, that he never intended to implement the Minsk agreement. And of course, the British and the Americans basically were working to sabotage the Minsk agreement. So she's admitted that the Minsk agreement was hollowed out, and she gives the clear impression, or at least this is my own feeling, that she was looking for some kind of Minsk 3 agreement, something to replace Minsk 2, and that perhaps this dialogue that she was trying to set up between the Europeans and the Russians was intended to achieve that. Now, I have to say that this is a classic example, if I'm reading all of this correctly, of how Merkel perhaps doesn't understand, despite everything, how the Russians think and feel about these matters. He might also explain a lot about Macron's actions, because it's known that Macron apparently offended the Russians intensely by telling Putin directly at one point, forget about Minsk 2, sit down and negotiate directly with Zelensky, find a way to sort out the Donbass issue, in effect, hand the Donbass back to Ukraine and we'll lift the sanctions and all will be well. And Macron didn't realize apparently how angrily the Russians would respond to that. And it seems from what I can see that neither did Merkel. Merkel never understood the extent to which appearing to drop Minsk 2, giving up on those proposals that she'd authored, forgetting the fact that Minsk 2 had been painstakingly negotiated and approved by the United Nations Security Council, no less, rewarding in effect the Ukrainians for their intransigence, was going to destroy trust from the Russian side. It also shows, in my opinion, the deep cynicism with which Western leaders, including Merkel, who really ought to have known better, respond to the Russians. Merkel and Macron seems to have thought that provided the price was right, the Russians would be persuaded to drop Donbass. This is despite the fact that Putin and the Russians repeatedly told the Europeans otherwise. It reminds me very much, by the way, of the same mistake that the Americans made with the Russians over Syria. When the Russians intervened in Syria in 2015, there's a whole series of negotiations between Secretary Kerry, Obama's Secretary of State, and Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in which the Americans were constantly trying to get the Russians to drop Assad, to agree to Assad's removal from the Syrian presidency. And the Americans thought that they could get the Russians to agree to that by offering the Russians all kinds of inducements, all kinds of bribes, agreements that the Russians would be able to retain their base in Syria, that they'd be allowed to join the anti-terrorist coalition that the United States was leading in the Middle East, all of these sorts of things. And I remember that the Americans always left these meetings with Lavrov, and indeed on occasion with Putin, absolutely baffled and furious when the Russians always said no, that they were not prepared to engineer Assad's removal from the Syrian presidency, that this was not what they were about at all, and that if the United States was serious in negotiating with them, it needed to take that fact into account and focus instead on what was supposed to be the joint interest, which was fighting jihadi terrorism in the Middle East, including in Syria itself. And it seems to me that the same is true of Merkel and of the other European leaders, but first and foremost of Merkel herself. She seems to have thought, well, Minsk didn't work, the Ukrainians won't oblige, the Americans and the British are against, so let's just drop it, let's offer the Russians bribes, let's see about telling the Russians we're going to lift sanctions, we're going to press forward with the Nord Stream pipelines, we're going to do all of these things, and in return the Russians will just cynically drop Donbass and the people of Donbass, and all will be well. And again, Merkel still seems to think that she could have pulled this off, even though there is no chance that she could have done so. There is absolutely no way that the Russians would ever have agreed to this thing, even though they tried to point this out to her time and again in talks after talks and in discussions after discussions. Classic Merkel, that she doesn't seem to have understood the extent to which her own actions and those of the other European leaders contributed to the collapse of trust, convinced the Russians that when Merkel brokered Minsk 2, instead of acting sincerely to try and forge a roadmap towards peace, she was in effect taking them for a ride. Well, there I think we see the difference, and I think this explains so much about Russian attitudes now. Their patience, which, as Putin said when he spoke to the mothers, had been extraordinary. Their willingness to go on negotiating, to stick with Minsk 2, to discuss Minsk 2 with the Europeans, to try to get the Europeans to understand that they were completely serious about Minsk 2. Their patience with the Europeans, their patience with the United States is completely exhausted. And now that they've seen that back in March, the one last attempt to negotiate a compromise with Ukraine was shot to pieces, again by the British and by the Americans. The Russians are determined to see this through, however long it takes, however much force is needed, and they're not prepared to waste more time on fruitless discussions or discussions which they would see as fruitless. Now, I don't think there's any understanding in the West of the extent and depth of Russian resolve here. I think that there's an awful lot of illusions still about Russia. There's still this idea that, this is a gimcrack, corrupt, kleptocratic, cynical, oppressive state, that it's going to run out of missiles, it's going to run out of microchips, that its army isn't going to be able to fight properly. I think, on the contrary, the Russians, as I said, will see this thing through, though Putin, when he spoke to the mothers, seemed to think that the 380,000 men who are now joining the Russian military will be enough for that purpose. Well, if I'm right about that, and I'm fairly sure I am, then we're in for a very long haul, because let's assume that the Russians achieve their military objectives in Ukraine, whatever they are, over the next few months. Let's assume even that the Ukrainian government collapses, which is what Lavrov is saying. That's not going to, in itself, end the crisis between Russia and the West. It could actually make that crisis worse. The only way out is for the Western powers to put aside all of these illusions that Merkel still seems to cling to, and to negotiate for once with the Russians sincerely and in earnest. Difficult to see how the Russians would trust them. That's the way. It's the only way forward. That's the only way out. Will it happen? I see no sign. And judging from all the signals that are coming out of Moscow, we're in for a very long haul. A debacle for the West eventually in Ukraine, but a much bigger crisis between Russia and the West going forward. Well, that's me for the day. Another long video covering a lot of topics. I hope you found it useful. Let me remind you that all our videos can be found on other platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, and Telegram. And of course, you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and also by going to our shop and buying the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those things. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon. And of course, don't forget, if you've liked this long video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again. And my next video, as I said, looking perhaps more at the military developments, will be coming soon.